Hi, I'm Dave Essinger, and I'm here with Benjamin Busch, who's here on the UF campus as part of the Richard E. Wilkin Events Series. And Ben has a copy of his new book, Dust to Dust, today. Ben, you're a poet, an actor, a filmmaker, an author, a photographer, a journalist. How is it that you've ended up working in so many different forms, doing all of the things? Did you know that these are all things that you wanted to try someday? Or did some just happen?
Oddly enough, writing was the one I didn't think I would pursue. My father was a writer, and not out of any kind of resistance to what he did, but I was kind of the one working out in the dirt while he was up in the workshop, typing away what I was doing in his own way. He was a great observer of the world, whereas I was far more of a participant. I was very kinetic. So, but I was always a very visual person, and so I thought that I could solve all of my problems with expression by way of imagery. So I drew. I went to Vassar College as a studio art major and worked in sculpture and in print and drawing, and then, like most artists, I joined the Marine Corps directly out of Vassar College.
An obvious transition.
And it was yet part of another thing, my constant intrigue with uncertainty. I think that I'm drawn to chase that, to seek out the unknowable and the unknown in my own way. And the Marine Corps seemed like a place where that challenge was constant. So that led me there, and oddly enough, it was war that led me to writing, because I couldn't really take pictures and send them home, although I took a picture a day or so on my two tours in 2003 and 2005. And it was the letters home. You could write a letter home for free. And so once a month I tried to gather my thoughts and try to paint the environment as I would as an artist, as a photographer. How does this place look, feel? What is it thinking? From my perspective, of course. And it was that led to the first use of prose. I didn't know, even though my father had been doing it his whole life, I didn't know that prose could do the same thing that I was trying to do with images. And that led me to work in all those different genres. Poetry does something that I can't do with prose. It isolates an observation or a moment in a way
Certainly.
that would feel diffused if I were to flesh it out with prose. So sometimes I write poetry, and then sometimes I just realize that what I'm thinking I see so clearly as a scene, as something which has movement and place, that I just know it's going to be a film. So I work between all those different genres because none of them by themselves solve all the the problems that I'm presented as an artist.
Certainly. You mentioned always being interested in the unknown, chasing after things that are new to you. Were you trying some of these media just to find out if you could do it?
I think that I started being more exposed to other people's work, and if you start reading poetry, you realize that it can do things that you hadn't really thought about doing yourself.
Sure.
And I think it was reading some poems that led me to considering that medium. I hadn't written poems until about 9 years ago. And there are still some poems that I started 9 years ago that I'm still writing. I don't think I've done it right. I haven't got it quite right yet. I haven't found the perfect words or the way to structure it, because poetry is far more, it has so many more options in its structure than most other ways of writing do, which is why I find it very attractive, but also very difficult. So I think it's mostly just the more art you're exposed to, the more you realize can be done. And I'm not one to give up on a thread when I get on it. Once I find something which is doing something amazing, eventually it seems like one of the solutions I need. So I've kind of moved through all these different genres just by way of seeing them done well, or seeing the options that each present.
Can you tell us more about your process and how that differs, or things that stay the same? Because I know that you kind of take a narrative approach to arranging your photographs for a show, or
Right.
It seems like there's a narrative thread in a lot of this work. Can you tell us things that stay the same when you're working on a like a film length work versus a poem, or things that are far different?
That's a great question, and I think everyone asks, what's your process? And it's kind of this strange question to answer because I'm not sure that. I mean, some people have a very clear process. I kind of work out of chaos. I think that's my base for everything. I think ideas are chaotic. I think our experience in the world is chaotic. And so usually I just keep myself surrounded by debris. Tiny notes, one line, one image, various other journals and things with other things are written, and film. So being surrounded by all these things, you begin to form connections. You begin to see how one thing relates to another. And sometimes that's where the magic happens. It's in that space in between. And then you write that space, that piece of connective tissue. And that becomes your work, how you get from one to the other, that's the labor of it. And so I think I'm always kind of writing a map. I'm always drawing maps. I love maps. And I think my work is very much based on the idea of following place. I want to always place people first. I think that's kind of the thing I'm most drawn to because I'm so visual. I want you to know where we are. And all my work, whether it's nonfiction, journalism from Iraq or everywhere else I go, my own memoir, my poems even, many of them focus first on putting you someplace. Sure. So we have a place to consider, and I like to try to really articulate a familiar sense of place, not to make it an unapproachable world, but something which is drawn and stenciled directly from where we all live. So my process really is, I like to see my work. If I'm making a film, I storyboard it in 3x5 cards. I put it up on a board so I can see how the film is beginning to form. And it allows me to move things around. It gives me the flexibility. I do the same thing with setting up a photo show. I get all my 4x6 photos out, I tack them up, and I begin to figure out which ones relate, how the narrative best works in a room. How do we see the order of these images? And the same thing happens for when I write anything. My longer pieces end up being shreds tacked to a board. So that's really my process, as if I have one, I guess. I'm surrounded by the world, and I kind of take that as my launch.
Super. Well, okay. On the theme of place, I know you're very visual and oriented and seen in that sense. Your last journalistic piece for Harper's Magazine talked about first you spent more than a year serving with the U.S. Marines in Kut, Iraq, if I pronounced that close to right. But 10 years later, you went back traveling independently, and I know that a part of what you had in mind there was presenting this as a place for us as readers. But can you tell us more about why did you go back?
Well, I'm also fascinated by aftermath. What happens afterward? We always kind of like to put conclusions on things. We write the end at the end of our books as if nothing's going to happen afterward. And after that tour in 2003 to these very small towns along the Iranian border, I couldn't find any information about them. No one went back there at all. In fact, when I got there, they hadn't seen an American in 7 years in some of these places at all. No one. No aid workers, no military, nobody. And I was almost like I was a specter showing up. And I wanted to kind of have a sense, now that time had passed, what did everyone really think? What did we do? What did we fail to do? What was the impression that we made, since it was an impression? How indelible were we? And or did we have any presence at all? Were we just a very passing group in a place which has passed so many foreigners through it? And actually we were, is what I found out. All my efforts were, in their memory, brief and inconsequential. And that's important for us to know as a people, and also for all the veterans who wonder what their service was worth, their value, as we begin to kind of worry over issues like that now, which has become, you see American Sniper debated very heavily right now.
Sure.
What's the American experience? We focus very much on the veteran. We don't focus on the place they went. And so, of course, that being the uncertain portion of the story, that's what drew me. So I had to go back to the place and ask those questions, see it for myself. I think it's interesting what happens to place too. It's always transforming. Even the small towns we grow up in, if we stay in them, we barely notice the changes. But if you leave and come back a decade later, very often it's surprising what's happened to those small places. The business you knew, the mom and pop breakfast place is gone, and in its place there's a dollar store. It happens to everyone, and I think you need some space to allow for a place to be different in your eyes. So if I went back a year afterwards, it would still very much be similar to what it had
changed enough, right?
Right.
Sure.
It's like your high school reunion. You need 25 years to find out
at least
what happened to us. So that's what drew me back, and I'll probably return again.
Sure. I know you'd mentioned that, but that's a project to come, right?
To come, yeah.
You had mentioned that you only came to the writing after your first time in Iraq, and part of that was the letters back, but was part of that also narrating the experience? Were you feeling a need to use the written word to describe what you were seeing there? And I guess I'm asking, that stuck after that. You kept writing after that, and you're writing some great stuff. So what did that start?
Just basically an understanding of the power of language. The other thing I like about it is a photo is a direct representative of something you see. Although you're cutting it out of an endless image, you're picking where those corners are. That's the artist's decision. But the viewer has to think around the space. They have to think beyond, like, if this is a selection of imagery, then what surrounded it? And that's where the story for the audience becomes important. They have to imagine for themselves part of that image. They have to establish its context in their own mind. I think that's the interesting thing about an image that doesn't answer all your questions. I think the same thing about film. If you get to the end of a Law & Order episode and you don't know who did it and they didn't catch him, that's the problem with shows like that. It's because you're presented with the problem and then you're given the solution, and then there's nothing for you to think about afterwards. You're done. That whole experience has been concluded for you. So I like things that are open-ended that way, that allow an audience to really figure things out. And the great thing about language is the only picture I'm giving you is words that represent things I'm seeing. And every viewer is going to see that space differently. And I think that's kind of fascinating. I would love to get a group of people who have read my book in certain places and say, how does this kitchen look to you? Because I have a very specific sense of it, as everyone does. And I chose very particular things to represent that space. But I have no idea what anyone else is seeing. And I think that's kind of fascinating. And that's the one thing that language does that really none of the other things do. When I make a movie, I'm showing you what to see.
Certainly.
I can't help it. I hope you're thinking about ideas in the film outside of the film, and the film is a bigger experience because of it. But in language, I'm absolutely certain that you're imagining something all on your own. The solitary nature of writing, I think, is kind of an incredible thing. You're all by yourself, putting down just these words to say these things, and then someone reads it all alone. And there's this intimacy and this distance between the two of you, and I think that's a kind of an interesting experiment, and I'm going to continue to pursue it that way.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that distinction between the fixed and unfixed media is really interesting. Do you think in those terms of, I know you're thinking about narrative and framing. I find myself talking about that a lot. The fixed versus unfixed media. The recent book that I'm teaching is police sketching Anna Karenina and giving us all the different possible images of Anna Karenina. And the image in your mind of Anna Karenina is not the image in my mind of Anna Karenina unless we watch the movie, and it's one for all of us. So.
Yeah, and that's another interesting. I've talked to a lot of writers who've had their books made into films.
Oh yeah.
and they all have very, very different takes on it. Some of them are like, well, I was glad I got paid. It's hard to have a writing life. But in a way, when I listen to the audiences, that's where I get the really interesting thing. Like when I did the Jack Reacher, so many people had such a specific idea of this huge hulking guy, and then it's Tom Cruise.
Right.
And now it's going to be Tom Cruise forever. In their minds, he's already been described in exacting detail.
You can't unsee Tom Cruise.
You can't unsee Tom Cruise. Even if you didn't see the movie, now he's crept into your imagination of who this character is. And before that, everyone had their own idea. And I think that's kind of one of those interesting things about the varying kinds of media. Like which one, kind of
Right.
has a more intimate power. And I once again, I go back to the book does in the end. Although, of course, I work in film, and some things in film that I wouldn't do as books, because I'm able to give, I'm able to juxtapose imagery in a way which I find really amazing. And I want to be clear about what I'm showing. I want to show you this specific thing exactly, and I want to make you have to leap the connections between the other images. And so, for that, I think a book can't touch the film. And there's other and reasons the same way you write poetry. There's reasons you do that, because there's certain things that poems do that
Right.
break up the structure of a sentence in a way that you cannot do any other way. We were talking last night about that, like how a sentence, when you do free verse, you can stop a sentence in the middle and move the rest of it down below, and it's still a sentence even if you write that way. But because of the way it's been broken up, now we pay attention to the word in the middle of the sentence. And we never would have if we just read it as a sentence. It just would have been another word. So the ability to punctuate and accentuate certain pieces of language in poetry, I find it to be unique. And sometimes I know when I'm writing something, this is going to be a poem. And sometimes I write a poem and I realize, it needs more, and this is going to become prose. So I move back and forth between all those genres. And every once in a while, I try to sneak some poetry into film.
You find that a generative experience, translating one thing from another, it gains in the transition often, I hope?
Yeah, there's no other reason to do it.
Sure.
If you're not going to gain, you're losing. So
Well, to find out, right?
yeah, why not?
Experiment.
Yeah.
Well, I love the idea of a kind of differently shaped intimacy through all those different media. For example, the structure in your memoir,
Mm-hmm.
Each chapter moving through time, and the way we talked about that. There's no way you could film that as a coherent movie, right?
Well, you could, but it'd be the strangest movie ever. My book's very visual in its descriptions, but and Hollywood looked at it initially because memoir and blah blah blah. They're very big on those for a little while.
I can't begin to think of how they'd film that.
Which is exactly why those meetings were so strange. I'm like, well,
Good luck.
knock yourself out. But basically, here's a whole scene where I'm standing on a raft. I don't say anything. It's all about that moment and the description of it. And yeah, you could film a kid on a raft, but then you'd have to use the artifice of kind of voiceover to tell us why we're looking at certain things, and you'd have to lead the witness so far that it would lose the art of it. In a way, it would be very difficult to make this into a film. But I can't say that anything can't be tried. I wouldn't try it, but in writing this, in the structure of this, I thought of films and in ways of taking this new structure for memoir and going, okay, what if I were to make a film designed in this kind of way, in this vignetted way, that moves in this kind of order? And I have no idea how I'd do it yet still, but it's one of those things that lies in my pile of debris as now I have another option. Now I have another way of seeing if I should choose to try.
Well, that was one of my last questions. On the topic of next things to try, the pile of debris, what's next? Can you tell us what you're working on, what you have in mind, what you're looking at next?
Yeah, well, because I come from chaos, I'm working on many things simultaneously in one form or another. Obviously, I have a few essays that I'd like to broach, which are nonfiction explorations of place and ideas. I have a few poems in the hopper. but also, I have a few feature films that have only suffered because of the inability of, it's hard to find money to shoot a feature film. And nowadays, because of the transformation in media and the way we watch things, everyone kind of expects things either for free or they're crowded out of theaters by the few conglomerates that still control, theater viewing from Hollywood. So I have a Vietnam film that I'd love to make. Now I think it's more ready than ever to be shot because of its relationship to, just our current wars even, like MASH was Korea for Vietnam. So I'd love to shoot that, but at this point you kind of need interesting patrons to risk in your art. And even though I think it's commercially viable, it's going to take someone with vision equal to mine to say, go for it. So I'm a little hindered in my large projects by the fact that they require financing. So for that, I can always sit at my farm in Michigan and continue to write what I'm writing and imagine other things as possible. But it's great to be here in Findlay, and I'm grateful to you and the University of Findlay for bringing me down. It's been great also to talk to your theater students and your writing students, and just kind of, my whole thinking is always that they all cross-pollinate, and it's great to bring them all together. So, thank you.
Well, we're very grateful to have you down here, Benjamin, and I hope some of those things that you have in the works come to fruition. We'll be looking forward to seeing more work from you in the next few years. So
I hope you do.
Thanks a lot.